I want to thank Stanley for a very nice introduction. Octavio Paz, that's a whole new level. But thank you so much, and Henny, both of you for being such gracious hosts today. And we're having dinner with Mike and Debbie, and I think halfway through dinner, I thought that maybe I shouldn't talk about Homelands. I should talk about tequila, if that's okay with all of you. But in reality, if you do get Homelands, just open the book, smell the pages, and the tequila would just come out. It plays a key central role. I thought about, to start off with, I do a little reading, part of the introduction of the book, and to set it up, I just want to tell you a story, the backstory to the book. When you guys were setting up the Foothills World Affairs Council here, 1987, I was in El Paso, Texas. I had been recruited by the Wall Street Journal to move to Philadelphia and to become a reporter, cover, at that time, Black & Decker, Hershey bars, consumer issues. And I thought for a while, why would I want to go to Philadelphia to cover consumer issues? I'm on the border. This is where it's happening. We had a moment in Mexico where you felt like the whole country was about to change with demonstrations in the northern part of Mexico. So the bureau chief from the Philadelphia bureau of the Wall Street Journal called me in May, and I kept saying, my professors at UTEP, University of Texas at El Paso, kept telling me, you're crazy, go, don't even think about it. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. I couldn't say yes. And I kept telling this bureau chief, can you hold up another month? Can you hold up a few more weeks? Suddenly it's November. And he got tired of waiting. He said, look, if I don't fill this position, I'm going to lose it in next year's budget. So he came to El Paso because he was thinking, this guy is Hispanic, Mexican-American. He doesn't want to leave his family. He probably needs me to come down and meet his parents and tell him that he's going to be okay. And he comes down to El Paso, and I remember he came with a bottle of wine. I told my mother, I said, this very important man is coming from Philadelphia. He doesn't speak Spanish, but I will translate. And there's some advantages to being a translator, And I kept telling my mother, I think he wants to take me to Philadelphia, but I don't have to go. I don't want to go. So just tell him that I can't go. And she just kept kind of looking at me, wouldn't say anything. Frank Allen, the bureau chief, shows up at our house with this bottle of wine. My mother had made some enchiladas. We had a restaurant in El Paso, so Mexican food, enchiladas, that's my mother's specialty. And I'm thinking, okay, at least Frank's going to come and not leave empty-handed. He'll get a great dinner and goodbye. See you in a few years, maybe somewhere along the road. And he sat there for dinner, my brothers, my sister, and my father, and he kept saying, your son has potential, and America's changing. The diversity is becoming a much more diverse country. We need people like him to come to Philadelphia to learn how to become a good journalist, a great journalist, and a writer. It'll take a few years, but we'll send him back to the border, maybe Mexico, maybe somewhere in Latin America, but he needs training. And my mother's just looking at him, And at the end, my mother says, I'm kind of like, I'm even inventing words like, he doesn't think I might be a great writer. It might be a waste of time. And my mother looks at him and says, take him. And I looked at her and I said, why would you betray me? And she says, but she asked Frank, he said, I want you to do a couple of things. One, can he stay for the holidays? It's November, Thanksgiving's coming up, Christmas. And two, can he leave right after Christmas, right after New Year's? I will make sure that he gets on the plane. No later than January 2nd. I think I bought myself another day, so I left January the 3rd. But I asked my mother that night as she was washing dishes, I said, why would you let me go? And she says, because I know nothing about journalism. I know nothing about writing. My life, your father's life, has been in the fields of working in California, the restaurant at El Paso. And she said, this man seems to care, and he seems to want the best for you. He says, there was a time when your father was a guest worker in the United States. We had farmers who would, come and recruit him and tell him the importance of coming to the United States and working in the fields. This man wants you to do something like that. He wants you to tell our stories. And that always stayed with me. So right before, I went through November, December, people are singing, the holiday music and all that, and I'm just dreading this, thinking, what am I going to do in Philadelphia? I would call in friends, colleagues, and asking one question. Do you know of any Mexicans in Philadelphia? And I'm thinking, I'm gonna go crazy. I'm gonna be homesick. One person finally calls a union activist in El Paso, Victor Munoz, and he called and says, I know of one Mexican. And he said, his name is Primitivo Rodriguez. Write the name, write the number, guard it. He may be the only Mexican, not just in Philadelphia, but in the Northeast. And so I took the name, I arrived in Philadelphia. I remember going through the El Paso airport, and I had what I thought was a warm jacket, and I passed through the sales, what do you call it, the gift shop, and there's a UTEP, a sweatshirt. I'm thinking, okay, now I'm ready. It's got the sweatshirt, I got a jacket. Get to Philadelphia, Frank Allen is waiting for me with his father's heavy jacket, a hat, a scarf, and he says, I knew you wouldn't be ready. And that was how this new adventure started in Philadelphia. Kept calling Primitivo, and he wouldn't answer the phone. And finally one day, the phone picks up and he says, bueno. And I thought, sounds like Mexican. No. And we started talking, and I realized that he was just as homesick as I was. He had moved from Chicago 3-4 months earlier. And we decided that we would meet every Saturday at an Indian restaurant because that was the closest thing to Mexican food. So it's snowing. I'm living right near the University of Pennsylvania. It's snowing. I think after the third or fourth meeting, I told Primo, I said, this Indian food, as spicy as it is, as great as it is, it's not going to work. Is there anything close to Mexican food? And he said, I was reading the Philadelphia Inquirer. There's a new restaurant that just opened up, Salud. It's called Tequilas. I'm covering consumer issues for the Wall Street Journal, and I'm already kind of cynical, thinking, this is what marketing people do, blah, blah, blah. And I told Primo, I'm fighting, and not fighting, but I'm arguing. I said, this is probably part of a chain of American restaurants, probably maybe part of this Chi-Chi's chain. And he said, what do we have to lose? We can either keep complaining or we just go. We ended up at a place on Locust Street, Locust and 15, Tequilas. And I remember walking in to Tequilas, and there's an altar to Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata. There's the Virgin of Guadalupe, and I'm just thinking to myself, so American. It's some marketing genius, took over this place. I'm walking up, and suddenly the music starts playing. I'm thinking, this is pretty original, It was Spanish music, but it was music that was really, at the moment, it was popular. It was hot, and I'm thinking, okay, this might be a good place. I can see myself coming here once a week, and listen to this music. The food is probably terrible, And we're sitting at the bar, and we're watching this guy going back and forth, with tequila and food. And I'm thinking, that food smells pretty good. It smells almost like my mother's back in El Paso. And looking at the guy behind the bar, and I'm telling Primo loudly, I said, I bet you this guy is not even Mexican. He's Italian. He's got to be Italian. And suddenly, he comes up to us and he says, David Suro Pineda para servirles. David Suro Pineda, I'm from Guadalajara. You gentlemen seem to know your food. You seem to know your drinks. It's a pleasure to meet you. And Primo and I just looking at each other, so embarrassed. And we've been just, digging at him the whole night. So that night, we met, just in that moment, we met 3 Mexicans. It was myself, Primitivo, David Suro. And then that same night, another Mexican-American walks in, a lawyer, Ken Trujillo. And that's the night that we all came together. And so I want to read just a short little piece here about that night at Tequilas. Except for Ken, we were the sons of a failed and incomplete revolution in Mexico, now living in Philadelphia, which was supposed to embody the best of a revolution and where the nation's founders drew up a constitution that would be the envy of the world for centuries. We were testing the tolerance of a city built in 1691 by William Penn, an aristocrat turned rabble-rouser who saw in his new land holdings a haven for refugees fleeing religious persecution and immigrants looking to reinvent themselves. David spoke of his passion for food and how he sought to seduce Americans with Mexican culinary culture and spirits, soft power, a term I would later learn. Ken talked about judicial justice, a vision for a more equal and inclusive country. Primo only hinted at what he was up to, secretly connecting workers on both sides of the border and devising efforts to empower Mexicans in the United States. I told him I just wanted to go home, to find a way back to the border or to the Mexico of my childhood, hopefully as a foreign correspondent for a big U.S. newspaper, an illusion that felt more like a pipe dream at the moment. Years later, looking back on that evening in Philadelphia, it felt as if we were destined to come together that night, in that moment, at Tequila's Table 21. 4 strangers bound for the unknown, unhinged from our old comfort zones, embarking on a chaotic journey. 3 immigrants from prominent immigrant exporting states in Mexico, Jalisco, Michoacan, and Durango. Ken, the New Mexican, an unwitting ambassador of mainstream America, still searching for his Mexican roots along the way. Our friendship would withstand the passage of time, some better than others. That night, we began a conversation that has lasted more than 30 years, turning on one fundamental and deeply personal question. How do we fit in? What does it mean to be an American and become part of its diverse mainstream, integrate into its colorful tapestry, its noble ideals, and timeless democratic principles? Whenever we thought we had figured it out, somehow the entire concept would escape us again. We seek the original idea, and then we destroy it, a cruel irony. Outside Tequilas on that evening, dawn began to envelop Philadelphia. Workers headed home, while others were about to begin as the city slept. Trucks plowed piles of snow, clearing Locust Street between Broad and Rittenhouse Square, exposing all that was left of a wintry darkness. 4 strangers searching for their own shadows at dawn. Before Angela speaks, I just want to say how lucky we are to have Angela, because we'll talk about the book, but we'll also try to bring in the themes of the book into the current situation along the U.S.-Mexico border. And I can't think of anyone more of an expert to talk about these issues than Angela. She's been throughout Central America, the region, Mexico, and now covering the U.S.-Mexico border.
I'm a longtime journalist too, and Alfredo and I met as young reporters on the border, covering the border. Like Alfredo, I grew up with one foot on each side of the border, U.S.-Mexico, and had a love for wanting to tell these stories. So a lot has happened during the time we've known each other, and we do want to hear from you. I mean, I'm sure you have a lot of questions about the border. In particular, this past year has really been unprecedented and remarkable for many reasons. But I want to start by asking Alfredo a few questions about the book, the development of the book, the writing of the book. I can't turn too much. And we do want to hear your questions, so start thinking about them. So you were talking about those 4 friends. Would you, do you think, have been friends if you hadn't met in Philly? It was such a particular place and time. And lately I've been wondering, would you be friends today? Because now most people go into a restaurant, if they don't know someone, they don't even look up from their phones. So what do you think about that?
I think about that a lot. I mean, we just celebrated more than 30 years of friendship. And as I thought about this book, I thought, you know, this book is really about friendship. It's a homage to friendship. It's a homage to tequila. And I'll explain. I mean, I don't think we would have been friends anywhere in Philadelphia. I mean, we're so different in so many ways. But we came together because we were all very nostalgic. We were very homesick. And we were trying to find a way to fit in. I went to Philadelphia and I thought, I'm not going to last here more than 3-6 months. Yet it became sort of something I look forward to leaving work. It helped that I worked on Broad Street, and I'm about 3-4 blocks from Tequila's. Primo was with the American Friends Service Committee, which is about 5 blocks. So it was very convenient for all of us. Ken was a special story because he had just graduated from the University of Pennsylvania as a law student, and he was now working with the biggest law firm. And he could write off $100 every day, you know, for meals. So we would always make sure that Ken was going to be there, because you know we get a free meal. But it became much more than you know just the food and the tequila, obviously. By the way, when I went to Philadelphia, I was much more of a beer guy. I knew nothing about tequila, so everything I learned about tequila was through David Suro. But I'll say a little bit about each friend. I mean, Ken is from New Mexico. He grew up very poor in Española, in the northern part of New Mexico. And it was through internships and fellowships and scholarships that he ended up at the University of Pennsylvania, became one of the best lawyers in the country. And ran for mayor, I think it was 3-4 years ago in Philadelphia. Left the race when his mother was diagnosed with a grave illness. She passed away. But so it was this very dynamic friendship. We had Ken that everybody wanted to be like Ken, because Ken was the American in our group. We were all sort of trying to be American, and we were all learning from Ken. Ken was learning from us. He wanted to be Mexican. He wanted to speak Spanish. He wanted to learn the language. He wanted to learn the appreciation of the things that we value. And Primo was a secretive one. When you ask the question about the iPhones and all that media, today's media, back then, I mean, we didn't have cell phones. I remember we thought Primo was a spy because during meals, the U.S., Mexico, they were talking about a free trade agreement, and Primo was always in some corner talking when the smoking, and we kept thinking, is he talking to the Cubans? We thought maybe he was a spy for the Cuban government, maybe the Russians. We were just fascinated, but we didn't want to mess up that friendship, so we didn't want to go there. We just like, this is fascinating. But he would say certain things, and then the next day it would be a story in the New York Times. We thought, okay, there's something strange going on here. And David was the immigrant who came for love. He met his love. David is from Guadalajara. He moved to Cancun, and was the manager of one of the restaurants there, Carlos O'Brien's. He met the flight attendant from American Airlines. They fall in love, and she decided to lure him away to Philadelphia, and that's how David ended up in Philadelphia. And he had arrived, I think, 5 months before we did. So like we all came together at a very difficult moment because we were making the transition. But we all looked to one another as a way to kind of get ahead, learn from each other. And 30 years later, oftentimes we look at each other and think, could we have been friends in El Paso or in Dallas or Denver or any other place? And we all agreed, no, we're too different. But it was that place that brought us together. I mean, if Tequilas is now 32 years old, so we're on our 31st anniversary of our friendship.
Well, the book, this is the second book for Alfredo, for those of you who don't know. The first one is Midnight in Mexico, and this one, Homelands. And I know as a journalist, it's very tough to write a book because you're used to telling stories about other people, and this is a story that's very personal, although it's nonfiction and really talks about immigration, the past, first in Mexico, the impact, and then here. But I was there when you came up with the idea for this book, and it actually happened here in Colorado. You want to share that story?
Yeah, I came to Colorado. We're doing book talks about Midnight in Mexico, and I was doing a talk at Tatter bookstores, Tatter cover bookstore, and great bookstore, by the way. You guys know that, right? But I remember asking my mother, saying, I told her I'm going to Denver. I know I had a couple of cousins here, moved from California, and I said, I'm gonna look up my cousins. And my mom said, you know what? They want to have a reunion with you, and there's a restaurant in Longmont, Colorado. So you guys can come together. I remember we did the book talk, and one of my cousins drove me down to Longmont. And I should give you a little background. I was born in a place called San Luis de Cordero, Durango, northern part of Mexico, northern state. And in our plaza, the main square, there's a little sign that talks about the Camino Real. There's a whole map that goes from Durango up to Chihuahua, El Paso, all the way up to Colorado. And it's a very significant little map. I mean, except back in those days, everyone was leaving for California. And that's during the Bracero program. In between the 1940s and 1960s, something like 5 million contracts were awarded to Mexicans to come in and help the United States, which was at war. So they would come in with special permits. My father was one of them. And he came in, and so our destiny was always California. Thanks to Lyndon B. Johnson, I was able to come in legally with the Immigration Nationality Act of 1965. We came in 1966. We didn't. I still remember crying and screaming, and then I guess I never want to leave anything. I didn't want to leave Mexico. I didn't want to leave El Paso. But my mother says, you did the same thing back when you were leaving Mexico. You just kicked and screamed and so forth. But I didn't understand this whole thing about the United States and America and, the streets paved with gold and so forth. But we came through El Paso onto California, and I remember on that bus ride, we had postcards from my father. My father's not a very touchy person, feely, but he did send us a postcard with the state capital of California, kind of saying, I look forward to being a family again. We'll be together. Because at the time, I didn't even know he was my father. He was a man who would show up once a year for the holidays, and then he'd leave. And we were on that bus, and I remember my brothers kept asking me, are we here? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And I would look at the postcard, look at the, and I'm thinking my house is going to look like a state capitol, And I kept saying, no, that's a nice house, but no. We ended up living in a trailer house in the melon fields of the Central Valley in California. And I mean, we were so homesick at the time. I mean, we spent years, like, I kept asking my mom, when will my cousins come? When will our friends come? And suddenly, the most incredible thing, and this is part of the narrative of the book, is the Mexican migration to the United States. But suddenly, my cousins, my friends showed up. Many of them came legally. Many of them came without documents. All of them were recruited by American employers who kept telling us, hey, we need more workers like your father. We need more workers like your mother. Do you know anyone back in Mexico? So we were calling relatives, friends, come to the United States. There are jobs. And suddenly, this little town of San Luis de Cordero emptied out. Suddenly, they were all in California, in the Central Valley, in the San Joaquin Valley. Through time, through initiatives with the government, federal government, they all became legal. I mean, at some point, there was always a legalization program. They became legal. And so I end up in Longmont expecting 2 or 3 cousins to show up. 38 people showed up. And I'm looking around the room and I'm thinking, what happened to California? And it's like, California doesn't pay like Colorado. And the jobs are much better here. The quality of life is much better. And when I wrote Midnight in Mexico, my agent, and this is what agents do, they kept thinking, think of this book as a trilogy. What's the next book you want to write about? And I kept thinking, I someday want to write about the Mexico within the United States. And I'm talking to my cousins, and all of a sudden, these ideas are forming after that book talk at Tattered Cover. And I asked one of my cousins, I said, you ever think of going back to Mexico, moving to Mexico? And she says, you got to help me here. Mexico's like this, petal de rosa.
It's a flower that never bloomed.
It's like a flower that never, it's so beautiful, such a beautiful flower, but it just never bloomed for us. So our destiny, our future is here. And she said, think of that sign at the square back in our hometown, the Camino Real, that whole migration. And I was thinking, and so I'm driving from Longmont back to Denver, and I'm just thinking in my head, my God, that's the story. That's the narrative. Got back to the hotel, I called Angela, I said, I think I have the idea for book 2. But and my idea was just write a story about the Mexican migration. A week later, I'm in New York City, and I'm talking to the agent. I thought, the agent's going to take me out for breakfast, going to congratulate me from Midnight in Mexico. It's a great book, blah, blah, blah. She just said, oh, that was a great book, so what's next? And that night, I was going to take the train from New York to Philadelphia to meet my friends. And all of a sudden, I thought, you know what? I want to write a story about 4 friends who meet on a wintry night in Philadelphia and tell the story about the great Mexican migration. And she says, that's really interesting. What about it? And I said, it's ending. It's coming to an end. And she said, that I want to read. So, you kind of pull it at the last minute, but I called David. I said, hey, David, I'm on my way to Philly. Get the tequila ready. But I'm going to write a book about you, Primo, and Ken. And he goes, yeah, sure, right. The tequila's ready. Get over here. And I think for the longest time, they didn't think I was serious. And I didn't think I could pull it off. But they kept saying, oh, yeah, and I would grab them together. We talk and talk and talk. And I think like maybe 6-7 months afterwards, they knew it was serious. And they got really kind of very serious with me and said, what kind of book are you going to write? And I said, it's a book about friendship. It's a book about what each one of us, what we're doing, and about our effort to become part of this society, of the fabric of America. our story, like the story of the Germans, the story of the Italians, of the Irish. We are just another chapter in America's history. And to their credit, they said, look, do it. And I said, look, everything I write, I want you guys to read it. Not for you to censor me, because I'm not going to let you censor me, but just to make sure it's accurate, make sure it's right. And so we would meet in Philadelphia, we would meet in Guadalajara, in Mexico City, and just, go over stories. This is the way I remember this is the way I remember that. And music was a very key part of the book, because you would pull certain songs, and this is back before technology and back before Facebook and back, before email. But David would keep like a catalog of songs that he would put at the restaurant. And I said, David, can you pull out those catalogs? Listen to those songs. And those songs would just create all these memories for us. And we would find pictures, or we'd find letters that we would write to each other. And so that all kind of helped us put the story together, come together. And obviously, the biggest thing was tequila. I would do fellowships, and I would call David. I said, David, just like I called him this morning, I said, David, is there Siembra Azul in Denver? And he told me yes. I would go to a place, and I would call him, and he would send places, or he would actually ship me a bottle, because if you have writer's block, that was my go-to.
Your secret.
Well, that was my secret. I would have tequila and write. And music, and then suddenly you find yourself crying, because you hit these peaks and valleys. You go up and down, but that's really the way I wrote Homelands.
So that's part of your writing process. What was the hardest thing about writing this book, and is there a chapter in particular that really was tough?
I think as immigrants in general, I think we're very hopeful. We're very idealistic. We believe in this thing called America. We believe in the values of this country. I think the most difficult thing for me to write, and it took a lot of you start writing and then you just break down. It was a chapter. It was about a week before the elections in the United States. And we were on the way to Durango. I take my parents to Durango every year.
2016 election.
2016 election. And it was for Day of the Dead. It's a tradition. And we go back home to honor the dead, honor my grandparents, honor my sister who died when I was a child. And one of the biggest fears of going back to Mexico in these rural places is obviously the cartels. So I called some law enforcement sources. I said, is this road safe? Can I go this way? Can I go that way? He says, as long as you go from this time to that time, you'll be fine. So I kept telling my parents that we're fine, everything's fine. And I looked at my mother, and I could just see her just worried, sad look. And I said, Mom, don't be worried. Chapo is in jail. We just passed Guadalajara. He's actually, past Ciudad Juarez, he's in jail. He's fine. The Chapitos, the groups that work for the Sinaloa cartel are known as the Chapitos. I said, the Chapitos are fine. Our relatives told them that we were driving, we were fine. And she said, that's not what I'm worried about. I said, what are you worried about? She said, I'm worried and question whether we did the right thing. Whether by migrating to the United States, we did the right thing. I said, what do you mean? She says, I think this man's going to win. And I think that's the end of us. I'm thinking, Mom, don't be so dramatic. This is the United States, So let me just read just a little piece there. So we're going back and forth asking my mother whether it was worth the sacrifice. Was it worth it for you, Mom? Was your sacrifice worth it? The silence between us spread like the growing distance, the gaping gulf between the United States and Mexico, the sliver of river that was meant to unite us, not separate with such vastness between us. She didn't respond immediately. Her eyes locked in the past, with San Luis de Cordero closing in on us. We left only with our memories of the past and hope for a better future, she said. When you're young, you leave everything behind, my mother said. You think something is better up there. You forget everything you believed in, everything you grew up with, and you don't ask questions. You work from sun up to sundown, wiping that sweat off your forehead. And for what? And now I'm back, and I ask myself, what if we had stayed here? Put all that sweat, all that effort here in my San Luis, and done everything to make this a better place. Not one that looks forgotten, lost, and abandoned. I wanted to tell her that we probably wouldn't have amounted to much. Maybe I could have become a merchant and eventually would have been forced to pay a bribe to some criminal groups, become part of its informal economy that now represents more than half of Mexico's overall $1.4 trillion economy. Or in the best scenario, I could have saved enough money, go up north, and maybe find myself a job as a waiter or a busboy in Philadelphia and California, where the tips are generous, I thought. But why break her heart even more?
I just have a couple more questions, so be thinking about what you might want to ask Alfredo. So reporting on your homelands, how hard is it to keep one foot in each country, and also really this past year, the changing U.S.-Mexico relationship we've been reporting on has been remarkable. Despite all these years of reporting on it, this really was a standout year this past year.
And now I'm going to turn the tables on Angela. Maybe draw you into the conversation. But I think one of the things I love about the border, love about living in El Paso, is that you are binational, you are bicultural, you are bilingual. And it's a place where you don't really have to choose anymore. You don't have to choose between this country or Mexico. You really feel like you are a bridge. I think that's one of the things that inspired me to become a journalist. It's to kind of build this, what I call a bridge of understanding between both countries. But you're right, I mean, it's been a tough year. And I always tell people, I said, I don't profess to be an unbiased reporter. I believe I can tell two sides to the story. I believe I can be fair to readers. But obviously, it's an emotional thing. Now, obviously, you're a reporter, and you're right in the thick of things, in the middle of the situation. You're seeing families that are separated. You're living in probably the 2 or 3 safest communities in the country, and suddenly you have walls going up. So that elicits a lot of emotion. It's like Carlos Fuentes said, between the United States and Mexico. He said it's a scar, and I think that's what I think these times that we're living in. It underscores that scar. It makes that scar more visible, and the themes that I try to address in the book. Yes, I came legally to this country, but the themes are the same. You have children coming into the United States, and you've been one that has covered that. 10 cities, separation of families. So I'll turn the question around to you. I mean, how difficult has it been? You cover the drug war in Ciudad Juarez. You've been to a lot of massacres in the city, and now you're witnessing to a different drama that's playing out.
Yeah, so many of you know this past year El Paso kind of became the epicenter of a lot of the strictest immigration crackdown policies, and everything from remain in Mexico, sending people back to Mexico. Of course, the family separation happened previous year, but ripping children from parents' arms. I mean, That's a tough one to say there's two sides to. Whether you agree or not with policies, that seems like something that we fundamentally, and we did hear a huge outcry from the American public about that. We've had, a tent city for immigrant children. We have, basically someone in Mexico said we now have a wall, but it's Mexico's National Guard who are posted along the both the northern and southern borders in Mexico. So in our area, Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. And so the strangest thing you've always seen, immigrants are now, they weren't trying to sneak in to the country, they were trying to get in and turn themselves into Border Patrol. So they were like trying to run towards Border Patrol and evade Mexico's National Guard. So it's like everything was turned upside down. And just a really, and these are Central American family, a different migration than what Alfredo's talking about when, single, mostly men, but also women would come up to work and then send money home, or sometimes bring their families. These are families coming up, migrating. So it was a different kind of migration, and people being held in these overcrowded holding cells. But I guess the biggest thing, and we'll lead into this question I also have for you.
You went to Central America. You cover Guatemala.
Yeah.
What was that?
Well, the other
situation
thing
like?
That's interesting is you also saw kind of the smugglers working hand. They felt like they were working hand in hand with President Trump. They would take his words and use them as marketing ploys, because every time he said, "We're going to seal the border," they would say, "See, you better get yourself up here right now. If you were even thinking about coming, this is your chance." So that actually helped kind of create this frenzy of people, just mass migration out of, especially places like Guatemala. If people were thinking of coming, they thought, "Well, now's my time. I better get up there."
There was one incident where...
Well, Alfredo and I teamed up on a story. And for those of you, you don't have to read Midnight in Mexico Homelands. We hope you do. But if you haven't guessed by now, we're colleagues, but we're also a couple. So
I think
so I thought we let that one out. We made you wait till most of the talk, but that's why we know each other. We were friends for a long time. And so we were traveling in Guatemala, and people kept running up to him, and one lady was furious at you. Why was that?
It was the only time that when I was covering the drug war in Mexico, there was a lot of suspicion that maybe I was a spy for the U.S. government. Maybe I worked for the DEA, undercover, et cetera. So you have to kind of deal with that, Or the same thing happened in Cuba. But in Guatemala, this woman actually came out and just said, get out of here. Leave now.
Run him out of there.
Just and I had my credentials. I'm a reporter for the Dallas Morning News. I have a credential from the State Department and the U.S. Congress, and I'm showing it to her, and she goes, "That's fake. That's." And I'd say, "Why?" She says, "You're a smuggler. You are a smuggler." Because I said I'm coming from El Paso, and I want to see if the situation is as bad as migrants say it is, And she said, "You're from El Paso, and you're trying to empty this town out." And I said, what does that mean? And we ended up having a really fascinating conversation. He said, these smugglers are coming in, they're putting ads in the paper, they're putting ads on the radio.
Social
media. If you want to reach the United States, do it now before they seal the U.S.-Mexico border. And so she says, it's emptying the town. Everyone's leaving. And everyone's going, they're paying $5,000, $6,000 a person, per family. And the smugglers are saying, get 2 for 1. Come, bring your kid with you. And they're not even crossing them to the United States. They drop them off at the Rio Grande, and they say, look at the Border Patrol. Go on, run across, and turn yourselves in.
And then, of course, asylum is not an easy thing, and the vast majority of people won't get asylum. But if they get to stay because of the backlog in the court system, they might make a little bit of money and go back home and buy a home or, start a little business. But most people mortgage what little they have. They sell everything they have to get that smuggler fee, so that they're worse off than when they left, when they're sent back home. So just to wrap up, I one last thing. I've covered a lot of the mass murders in Juarez and other parts of Mexico, so have you, but I have to say the other shocking thing this past year was I covered a mass murder in the U.S., in El Paso, in our hometown. And that was stunning. And you know, we're still trying to recover from it. But I remember we were reporting on that day, and you remember what you did. And he wrote a very poignant article about that, and maybe you could share some of that about what was happening. And
well, when the paperback version of Homelands was coming out, my editor asked me to write a piece about what the El Paso massacre had meant, and he said, you asked very poignantly at the beginning of the book, how do we fit in? He says, I want you to keep that in mind as you write, how do you fit in? And I think without reading this piece, I think the lesson I learned is, how do you fit in? To find that answer, you look at the immigrant roots of this country, because that's where the answer lies. It's in the humble beginnings. It's in telling stories. It's in retelling these stories of immigrants. So I thought to finish over lunch, Stanley went on and on about some of the parts of the book that he read that he really enjoyed. And on the way over, he said, I marked some of the places that I really liked, and I would appreciate if you read it. And I looked at it and I said, those were some of the best parts that I remember writing, where you write and you get this big smile. And that's, in the book, you're looking at identity, at, a placement of fitting in. And towards the very end of the narrative, we're at Tequilas in Philadelphia, and David is thinking, okay, the American dream is over. I'm going back to live in Guadalajara. My kids are growing up. They're half Italian, half Mexican. They don't need me anymore. It's over, and he's very pessimistic. I'm actually thinking the same thing. I'm thinking, okay, maybe I'll just go back to Mexico City and become the correspondent. And then Primo, of all people, looks at us, and he says, no, you're not. This is your home. This, in the United States, is where you belong. And so it was a little part where he says, if we didn't have to decide anymore about who we were, both Mexican and American, we did have the right, the responsibility, even to decide to make a difference. I could see that Ken and David had turned a corner. They seemed comfortable alone. This is after a long fight about the restaurant. It was clear as I looked at David and Primo that we now had two souls, or maybe we had always had two souls that belonged to either side of the border. We were constantly searching for a part of ourselves, only to realize that we had found ourselves on one side of the line. We would inevitably remember the other. Perhaps this whole geographical thing was just a fragment of our own imagination. Perhaps throughout our journey to understand ourselves as immigrants, we were really just searching for a way to coexist with one another. Where were you more Mexican? Primo asked us again. I looked at David and knew Primo was right. No other country could have made us more Mexican than right here in Philadelphia, right here inside Tequilas. David folded his arms and shook his head in agreement. He had lived more than half of his life in Philadelphia. I cannot leave Philadelphia behind, he confessed, just as I cannot leave Guadalajara for good. How many people can say they are truly binational? Not many, I think. What was once an emotional baggage is now a privilege, David said. I told David I'd been away from Mexico for more than 2 years, and I had not gone nuts yet, but that was probably because I knew I could always go back. America gave you the possibility to develop your Mexicanness, Primo said. Isn't that what you were trying to say, Primo? That in itself was worth the sacrifice. Your Mexican identity grew, Primo echoed. You sacrificed and became more Mexican and something else. You didn't have that possibility in Mexico, I said. The United States its spirit, its meaning has transformed us. Somehow, we had crossed over organically without much of a fuss until now. Americans fall in love with you, David, and the restaurant that you have built, Primo said. They are fascinated. They're copying your food, your tequila, your mezcal, even your music. That's what the United States does when it wants to adopt you. They copy you. It's called flattery, mainstream acceptance.
I'd like to ask you about a very current issue. We have a very important guy here in the United States that's building a high wall that's very long. What is your reaction to that? And what does that say about our willingness to let more Mexican people come in?
I was telling Mike and Debbie over dinner that one of the things maybe it hasn't hit Americans yet, but Mexicans aren't coming anymore. Mexican migration is at an all-time low. I mean, when I was reporting this book, I came to Denver, I went up to Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, and everywhere people would ask me a question: where are the Mexicans? What happened to the Mexicans? And the answer is, part demographics. It used to be Mexicans were having 7 children to a family. It's now down to 2. But there are more jobs in Mexico. Not necessarily great paying jobs, but there are more jobs where people feel like, okay, I can stay, I can try to make a go of it. And the other factor is it's much more dangerous to cross the border. You have cartels in Mexico that really control certain regions. So to get across, you don't, back when my family was in Mexico, you knew who the smuggler was. It was usually a neighbor, someone who lived in the neighborhood. So that person was responsible for getting you across. And the persons who would keep you accountable were the families in the United States. They had to go to your house and knock on the door, and before they asked for payment, they had to bring the relative and say, here's Angela, here's Stan, you owe me $1,000 or $500, whatever it was. That's not the system anymore. Now you have to pay drug traffickers or criminal groups who don't really worry about your safety. I mean, they're there to make a buck. So in general, the migration has really fallen. And I think Americans are coming to the realization that, they're going to miss the Mexicans. There's a huge labor need across this country. I don't think Mexicans have gotten their due that, many communities, many small towns in this country, were revitalized by them or by immigrants like themselves. When I arrived in Philadelphia in 1987, downtown Philadelphia was a mess. It took the immigrants to build that place up. And I think that's something that Americans have to realize or think about as we move forward. Are we still a country of immigrants? Do we really need a wall when you have such a low migration coming from south? The thing that worries me as a reporter, and I'm going to hear Angela's thoughts, but as a reporter, you're covering the story that in many ways, is a manufactured crisis that's coming from somewhere else. And you don't want to be part of the optics, to scare the wits out of people across the country, but it is a humanitarian crisis. So, how do you cover that?
Well, and the thing about the wall, it exists along long stretches of border. It's not a wide open no man's land with hordes of criminals coming across. There are pieces of wall, fence, whatever, steel slats, whatever we're calling it in certain places. It is being expanded and upgraded. But it's not an effective tool. People who are determined get over it, around it, under it. Drugs come, the majority of drugs these days come through ports of entry, across bridges.
Or through the ocean. If you look at the transcripts from the Chapo
They come, and not necessarily through the border, but smuggled through vehicles, and these are very potent and dangerous drugs that can be brought in smaller quantities, not the old-fashioned like marijuana bales that were brought through the border. So that's not effective either. And so it will have an impact on wildlife and on the environment, especially in some of these very delicate biospheres along the border. So that a lot of people are concerned about that. But as far as an effective tool, it's not a modern day tool for dealing with migration or drug trafficking. And people say, oh well, those who don't want a wall are for open borders. That's not true either. If anyone wants safety or security, it's the people who live on the border. But the vast majority do not think a barrier is going to. It's kind of a false sense of security that's created by having a wall.
My question is about, is this on?
Yes.
Okay, my question is about language. I envy people who are bilingual. But I had a conversation with a woman I know, my age, she's in her early 80s, who speaks Spanish fluently. She's bilingual, she came from Mexico. And I says, what language do you speak in the home? Expecting her to say, well, I'm teaching Spanish. She says, well, it's mostly Spanglish. And I said, well, how about your children? She said, well, they're not too bad. I said, how about your grandchildren? Not so much. I said, why in heaven's name not? And she says, well, we're kind of uncomfortable doing that. And for heaven's sakes, I do not understand that. Why in heaven's name, if you have an opportunity as a child to grow up bilingual, why not encourage that as something good rather than as something you're uncomfortable with?
Well, we can both answer. I mean, it's the age-old immigrant story. You feel like you're going to give your children a leg up if they learn English, if they know English. And I'll just give a quick example. Like in El Paso, all of the schools are dual language. Everybody, all of the students learn English and Spanish both to read and write and speak. And the people who wanted it most were non-Hispanic families. They really saw the advantage in that. And the people who there was an outcry from were the recent immigrants. Like, wait a minute, we're not learning English in school. So there is this real fear that, and it's just a natural thing. All immigrants, I'm sure many of us, if we all have. Crossing borders is in our DNA, and if we went back, I'm sure there's some relative who at some point crossed the border and came to the U.S. and said, no, we're all learning English because we don't speak our original languages. I am very fortunate that I did grow up speaking both English and Spanish.
Next question's over here. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you both so much for speaking tonight. What would you say is the most common misconception about illegal immigration?
That they're dangerous, that they bring diseases, that they're taking jobs of Americans. That was to me that was the saddest part about August the 3rd, the mass shooting. It was my father's 83rd birthday, and if anyone embodies that American dream, it's someone like my dad. I mean, he worked his butt off, in tractors and did all the jobs that Americans didn't want to do. And anytime we would push back and say, why did we come here? He would tell us stories how this country gave us opportunities and so forth. And then to have someone come from 800 miles away, drove 10 hours to kill Mexicans because he was afraid of the demographics taking place.
Well, he called it an invasion.
Call it an invasion. And then you read this this manifest, and it talks about they're taking our jobs and so forth. That's the biggest misconception. I think at least the Mexicans I know are here trying to find a way to make a living, contribute to their new country, and dream that their kids would do better than they did. I mean that's why my parents came up. I mean that's why they sacrificed everything they knew, everything they lived, so that we could become something ourselves. And that's the thing that when I'm covering migration and I go to Philadelphia and if you talk to David, he'll say, the biggest problem this country's going to have in now and in the coming years is this whole labor shortage. It's people are not coming in to do jobs, whether they're from the Middle East or whether from Mexico or somewhere in Latin America. They're just not coming in the same numbers. And that's going to have an impact in this country.
Just tell us a little more about your path as far as how long you did journalism on consumer products in Philadelphia before you were able to get back to El Paso and do migration journalism.
I lucky for me, Ronald Reagan was president, and he had just passed the Immigration Nationality Act. He had just no, it was IRCA,
Immigration
Reform and Control Act. So there was a big story across the country, and I was stuck covering consumer issues until my editor realized I was trying to really fit in. And I was trying to, kind of going back to that question about being bilingual, I was trying to become so American. All my colleagues at the Bureau were either from Harvard, Columbia, Northwestern. I think there was one person from Arizona, and I'm from El Paso. So I really wanted to fit in. I changed my dress code. I was, wearing suits. I remember Ken took me to Wanamaker's to buy suits. I was eating hoagies and so forth. And I remember Frank came up to me and said, I recruited you because I thought you were different, because I wanted to bring that point of view in the stories that you write. And I said, well, I'm not sure how I can bring that story to a Campbell Soup or a Hershey. And I said, Frank, there's a big story in this country. He said, yeah, I've been thinking about that. I'm going to make you become part of the immigration team. And suddenly I'm with Jose de Cordova, who Stan knew many years ago. We just found out today, and Diane Solis. And suddenly I'm traveling from Philadelphia to Texas, to the border, to Chicago, covering this changing country. So I would say it took me maybe 6-7 months. I remember I didn't have a credit card. And I would go to a place like Chicago, and Frank would just stuff me with cash. And I would show up at a hotel in Chicago, and I would pay with cash, and they just look at me kind of funny. This guy coming from Mexico, what's going on here? So it took a while. And then, I mean, my dream was always to kind of reconnect with Mexico. And when that wasn't clear, I mean, I remember one of my editors said, you're going to have to cover a lot more stories, keep writing, you have to improve as a writer. I thought, I don't have that much longer. I mean, I want to be in Mexico. And so I ended up working eventually for Scripps Howard, covering the border, US-Mexico border, and then the Dallas Morning News, where I've been there for more than 20 years, covering Mexico and covering the border.
Yeah, when Julian Castro was running for president, he talked about like USAID down to Central America to try to, rather to stop the flow is to help people down there develop. And I'm wondering about the organization of Africa, of South America, with all like what's happening in Venezuela. I have a friend of mine who's from Bolivia, Colombia. It's not just Mexico or Central America. There's a whole issue of Mexico, Central America, and South America, and what America should be doing there. And I'm curious what you think.
I mean, that's a great point. And I'll tell you, the Americans as the Mexicans, the new president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, that's his plan. Is you got to pump in money into Central America, into the region in general, to stop the migration. One of the things that we don't really talk about enough is the impact of climate change in that region. I mean, many of the people we talked about, maybe you can chime in, but many of the people we talked about are small farmers who ended up being forced to leave because the rain wasn't coming. Their plots were, there was no harvest anymore. There's one person that I met last year, and from Guatemala. I've been following him. I did one big story last year But our plan is to follow him to see what happens to him, in this country. He came with his son. I think his son is now 11 or 12. But he was a farmer, and he says, I didn't want to leave my country. And even now, sometimes I talk to him, I feel like it's a therapy session, because he's telling me about all these problems, all these challenges, but he says, my kid loves it here. He loves learning English. He loves learning a different culture, and it reminds me a lot of my parents. But he said, had we had an opportunity, economic opportunity, I would have never left. Had we had, I think he grows beans in that area, but he said, it just stopped.
Well, the big challenge is finding governments you can trust to give that funding to, because there is a lot of corruption. And, the citizens themselves will tell you that. So finding vetted, reliable nonprofits, locally grown, not necessarily from outside. And it can be very simple things. If you live up, especially in Guatemala, if you help a mother, it helps the whole family, in terms of economics and health care and maternal care. And I just did a very simple story over the weekend. It's called Weaving for Justice, and it's a group of women who in New Mexico who actually bring up products from Mayan women who weave, their traditional garments and things. And so that's been a way to help keep some of those weaving cooperatives successful, so people can stay home. So sometimes it's something very, very simple, and not handing a giant, wad of cash to a government that isn't going to deliver.
Ice cream coming. Okay. I have a potential daughter-in-law who's a DACA kid, brought to this country by Mexican parents when she was very small. And she's been very successful, but successful in school and so forth, and has a good job. But could you even guess what the future might hold for her?
Go ahead. Oh, thank you. No.
Well, it's supposed to be a bipartisan issue, and you hear that everyone agrees that these are some of the best and brightest who should stay in this country. These young people don't know any other country, but unfortunately, this still remains so uncertain, and it is destroying lives, because people they can't plan ahead. It's just, we'll see what happens with the next election, but it's really hard to predict.
One of the stories I've been following in Mexico, the number of DACA people who have been deported, who are back in Mexico. And these are immigrants who left as children and know nothing about Mexico. I remember I was walking at the monument to the Revolution in Mexico City, and I'm looking for this office, because I said, you got to go there. There's an office of people who've been deported back to Mexico. And I see all these Mexicans in front of me, but they were all speaking English, and they couldn't speak Spanish. And that kind of gives you a sense of what's happening. And the remarkable part of that was they were taking down this rundown area at the Monument of the Revolution, and they were revitalizing it with restaurants, barbershop, taqueria. And I'm thinking, this is a story that was being told in the United States. But they don't get the kind of support that migrants get in this country. Back then, they're really struggling to kind of make it happen. So you look at the future through their own eyes, and you see how difficult and unpredictable the future is. I keep in touch with them, because I want to do a story as to what happens over time. Do they try to go back home? If you catch them in the afternoon, they're usually on their cell phones talking to their families, back in Dallas, back in LA. And, you've seen them and telling their kids, you be a good student, behave with your mothers, etc. It's really heartbreaking to see that.
From what we hear, it seems like asylum seeking is the main channel for legal entry presently, with the work programs being in the past and not active now. And asylum seekers, as we understand it, are turned back at the border when they come through ports of entry. They make their claim, they're sent back to wait to go through the courts. How about the asylum seekers who come over illegally, turn themselves in, as you described, to the Border Patrol? Are they sent back? Do they get a court case? And with this whole program, it seems choked up with so many asylum seekers. What is the length and process for getting them approved as asylees for admittance?
So you're right. Yes, that both cases, if you come between ports of entry without documents and then trying to get through the port of entry, which you were encouraged to do, people are sent back to Mexico. They are, and these are not Mexicans, so they're waiting in another country. They are given a court date. Vast majority don't have. It's very confusing. The court date's not always right. They have to show up at the bridges, figure out how to come across. It used to take. There's a huge backlog. It could take months, or it could take years for your case to go through the court. Now they're prioritizing recent arrivals with this idea that they're cutting off that incentive for people to come and stay for a couple years. But the reality is the vast majority will not be granted asylum.
After the large migration, I mean, it seems that the Latino community could be very powerful. But interestingly, we see with the demographics and the polls that come out, when they talk about a disapproval rating for Trump or some of the current policies, when they talk about the Black community, that's very high disapproval. And then when it comes to the Latino, Hispanic votes in the polls, that disapproval goes way down. Can you talk about what's happening in that, because it seems to be kind of voting against your own interest?
Right. First of all, it's not monolithic. When we say Latinos, and that's something that's really important to remember. If you go to the East Coast, you're going to get a lot of Latinos who are for Trump, because they're coming from socialist countries, Cuba, Florida, Venezuela, etc. So there's a lot more support for a person like President Trump. That's why you hear a lot about Maduro is always in the news and so forth. Mexicans, I mean, the Mexican American, I think the last number I saw, and this has been a while, I mean, it's something like over 70% disapproval of Trump, or higher. There's a group in California that actually has been following this. I think in 2006, the overall Latino approval of then candidate Trump was 29%. But you're right. I mean, only half of the 29 million Latinos who were eligible to vote in 2016 actually turned out to vote. That's pitiful. The number this year, it's 32 million people are eligible to vote. I'm not going to predict. I mean, come November, we'll see. But I know that the efforts to register people is way high. And you're right. I mean, these policies are really impacting immigrants, Latino immigrants, whether Mexicans or Central Americans. But there's also a big campaign to try to, keep people from actually turning out to vote. Maybe you can talk about that.
Oh, voter suppression. Real concerns that people won't go to the polls or feel like their vote matters. But we'll see, because especially young people, you have to engage people. But lastly, I said that there's a real concern to the spread of hate. People are afraid. They really are. It's hard to overstate that, and in places where you would like to see a lot of turnout for whoever people vote for, there aren't as many. But maybe that'll change by then. The rhetoric really did have an impact on. I mean, you could say people maybe voted for Trump. We've heard because if you're Catholic, the right to life or anti-abortion. Also, people thought, oh, he was a business person, he's going to create jobs, and so those economic things. But now I think that with this rise of hate, you are seeing people. I mean, some of the people killed in the El Paso shooting were MAGA supporters.
I mean, one of the saddest questions I ever got was doing a book talk in El Paso. Majority Hispanic, 83, 84% Hispanic. And one woman got up and asked me a question and says, "What's it like out there when you do book talks?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "What's the hatred like? Because I'm afraid of traveling outside El Paso." And I was stunned. And this is an American educated woman whose sons are in the military, but that's the impact of this hatred. That's it's impacting communities like El Paso. That's why that mass shooting was so disheartening.
I wonder if you could talk about illegal immigration, and in particular this question that has polarized our politics so heavily, and that is on the right we have people arguing for rule of law, and we have laws about immigration which they want enforced. On the left I've heard humanitarian arguments, but I've never heard the legal argument on the left for immigration. Is that we should change the immigration laws? Is that the current immigration laws aren't fair? I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your opinions and what you think what should be done with respect to the immigration laws and this illegal immigration question.
Angela?
Well, as journalists, we don't like to give our opinion, but I will tell you one thing that's very, very clear, that both left, right, anywhere in between, everyone agrees the current system is absolutely broken. It's not working for people coming in legally, and there is an effort to curtail legal immigration. And certainly it's become, as you heard from Alfredo, more dangerous and terrible and profitable for organized crime for people to come undocumented. The vast majority of Americans say they want some sort of immigration reform to fix some of these problems, to make it fair, but to also make sure not just anyone comes in without a process. But there's been zero will in Congress to do anything, and certainly no will on the part of any recent president.
But is that because our current laws are unfair? I'm trying to understand what's the problem with the current laws and why it's creating such a polarization.
Well, let me ask, why do you think? You must have an idea.
I don't. I'm confused about this issue about enforcing the existing laws, which seems to make sense to me. Like it seems to be causing this humanitarian problem, and I'm confused about, is it a fairness problem? Are the laws unjust? Are they laws that aren't good laws? What's the problem?
Well, a lot of people will say, I came in legally, I did it the right way, but the reality is today, the reason people do come in an undocumented way is people trying to do it the right way, it can take 20, 30, 40 years. And so that's what that incentive is. Even people who you might think would qualify. So that's what the incentive is. People say, why don't you just get in line and do it like everyone else? It can take a lifetime. We have a friend who was her father-in-law just passed away, and her sister-in-law was going to come in through the father. Now, she waited 40 years? She's definitely not coming. So no, I mean, the laws need to be looked at. And yes, I know there is rule of law, and you can't just promote everybody come in no matter what. But I think that there needs to be a real concerted effort to look at why aren't the laws working? How can we modernize them? And yeah, I don't think it's an either or, open borders or crack down on everybody. There has to be something rational.
And what's causing that backlog? Why would it take 20, 30, 40 years?
The process is that long. It can be, and if you're talking about asylum, it's a lack of immigration judges, which now we have more, but certainly not enough. But it's a very complex, that the whole process itself is very difficult.
I mean, we're talking about...
and expensive.
People who were trying to come legally through the border. Last story I did was about, what's happening to all the Central Americans. Well, the majority, I mean, it's not that they went back home and they're trying to make it work. I mean, they're now coming the illegal way, coming to trailers throughout Mexico. I mean, we're seeing more deaths along the border again, because the incentive of reinventing themselves, of having a new beginning,
and having jobs waiting for them. That's another part of immigration law. I mean, we have to also take responsibility. There are all these employers luring people up here, and if they didn't hire people, they wouldn't have a reason to come.
Whether I remember interviewing people in Mexico City who were waiting, migrants. Some of them were on the way to work at Walmart because all these Walmarts are opening and there's construction jobs. Home Depot, the Trump organization, to work in the wine industry. It's everywhere. And that's something that I think Americans want to kind of look the other way. Like it's really not happening.
So yeah, if you could maybe get guest workers or bring people in legally, most people do want to go back home. They don't want to stay permanently, at least initially, and then they build lives here and they can't go back and forth. I mean, I've interviewed people who've risked their lives, teenagers, to get a busboy job that was waiting for them in Houston. Now, when you see those big raids, who gets locked up or thrown in jail or sent back? The migrant, right? Very rarely are the employers punished.
One of the things that's happening, just real quick, in my hometown, back in Durango, is that more and more of my relatives are coming to the United States the legal way. And I said, what do you mean? He says, they're expanding the guest worker programs, but they've asked us not to talk about this. I said, what do you mean? He says, they don't want publicity. But some Americans are realizing that we need these workers. So they're coming in, quietly, for 3 months, 6 months, but there is a limit. You can, I think it's 50,
there are very
60,000.
few guest worker visas, especially if you look at agriculture. It's totally inadequate. But so that's a good thing that could be done quickly to fix that issue. There's a
lot of pressure to kind of expand that, but obviously it's an election year. The optics just don't work for that.
We've got one final question up here in the front, and then I was also hoping, I know we're running out of time, you haven't spoken to having your lives threatened by the story you covered with the cartel. I was hoping you could speak to that just briefly, and then we'll have our final question.
Okay, it's in midnight in Mexico. I got too close to the cartels, essentially.
Okay, what that you have to clarify.
I got too close in covering the cartels, and as an American journalist, really as a foreign correspondent, you learn quickly that you can write about cartels. They love that. They love publicity. They love publicity about how this kid, ended up owning a Rolls Royce, BMW, etc. That rags to riches kind of story. But when you start digging into the connections between the government and criminal groups, that's when the trouble begins. And in the 2007, 2008, I was really focused on one organization known as the Zetas, whose base of operation in the United States was in Dallas. So I started doing stories about how this group and criminal groups were having meetings, secret meetings, with members of the Mexican government, with members of the military, when a U.S. source called me and said, "You're getting too close." I got a call from a snitch who says that they're going to kill an American journalist in 24 hours, and I think it's you. And I would get out. And I was getting ready to celebrate. I won a Cabot Award back then. We were going to celebrate with the community of journalists in Mexico City. And I called my colleague and I said, I think we need to call the dinner off. They're supposed to kill an American journalist. And they say it's me, so I don't think you guys want to be around me. And my colleague said, no, we want to be around you. We want to show solidarity. We want to send a message that if they go after you, they're going to have to come after us. And if they're going to come after us, we want to have a good meal and lots of tequila inside of us. But the interesting thing about that was that the response from the U.S. government. I mean, immediately after that, the U.S. government, the U.S. Embassy in Mexico City put out a press release saying, you will not touch an American citizen. Sending a very clear message. And I often think about that today. I often wonder, if I was doing that story again, would the government's response be the same? And we have debates, is it worth putting your life on the line? I don't think so, but I think as an American journalist who has protection, I think you have a responsibility try to go further, try to push. I don't know that I would take that chance again, you know.
Just anything we face pales in comparison to what our Mexican colleagues, journalists, face. Mexico's one of the worst countries for journalists anywhere in the world. Many have been murdered, kidnapped, disappeared. How many was it last year? One of the highest years.
Yeah,
I mean, so you can't even keep track.
But the solving the crimes in Mexico has like 98, 99% chance that you're not going to solve the crime. So whether it's a regular resident citizen or a journalist, you know, they're going to get away with that, and that's part of the big reason why they keep killing journalists in Mexico.
Yes.
I'm a Canadian, and I came across
Legally,
but it took me a year to apply and to get through immigration. And they told us at that time that it was because there's such a high quota of the number of people coming from Mexico and Central America. Is that quota changed since then?
I think if you repeat the question, it was a little hard to hear.
Okay, and I'm not sure I understand the question, but make sure I'm understanding it. So you were able to come as a Canadian. It took you about a year, which seemed long to you, right? It seemed long. You know how many people wish they had that year?
We had to wait, you know, because there was such a high quota of more people
coming from Central America. But you didn't come as an asylum seeker, right? So that would have no effect on your, so I don't know who told you, why they would tell you that. No, that's a whole different immigration court system to deal with asylum. Well, did you come in on what kind of visa or? Okay, so you got a green card. Yeah, that's very quick. Yeah, it takes 3 to 5 years for most people. No, green cards take 3 to 5 years. Well, here we have experts in the audience who can answer that better than I can.
Yeah, I spent 30 years working in that field. That's really fast. Maybe for Canadians it's slow.
Yeah.
You Canadians are so lucky.
I think the second part of the question was about quotas, and do those quotas still exist?
It's different. I mean, the thing they mentioned about a quota because of Central Americans, that had no impact on you. And there's lottery. It's a very complex immigration system. Lottery systems, and now there's an effort to change the system, but. You got an expert right there. Go talk to him right afterwards.
That'll be a whole nother program. Thank you very much, Alfredo and Angela.
Thank you. Thank you.